If you are listening on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, it would be greatly appreciated if you could give the podcast a 5-star rating. This helps other listeners just like you discover the show. Thank you. This is Beyond BJU, Exposing Fundamentalism. I'm your host, Andrew Pludger, and I'm a survivor of Bob Jones University. BJU is a fundamentalist college with its roots in white supremacy and is known for its culture of indoctrination, conformity, and control. Its influence extends beyond its campus, impacting Christian schooling, politics, biblical counseling, and evangelical Christianity. The school serves as a hub for churches, schools, and camps, and these institutions perpetrate its abusive teachings and practices. This show explores these areas of influence and amplifies the stories of those who have been impacted by Bob Jones University. This is Beyond BJU, Exposing Fundamentalism. Hello, listeners. I'm really excited for you to hear this interview with Sarah Caton. I really enjoyed this conversation as we both discussed our own upbringings in fundamentalism and the fear and terror that is instilled in you from such a young age. And with Sarah's story, she discusses really being a preacher's daughter and the pressure that was put on her to be perfect all the time, and believing that if she strayed in any way that could lead someone to hell. And she discusses the other impacts of just the fear of fundamentalism and its impact on her. And we also discuss its impact on developing children. But she also comes on the show to talk about her memoir, Deconstructing, Memoir of a Preacher's Daughter, which is out right now, and the link is in the show notes. But enjoy this interview with Sarah Caton. Hello, everyone. I am really excited to have Sarah Caton on the show today because she has a memoir that is out by the time this episode will be released. And I am so happy to have her on Beyond BJU. But thank you so much, Sarah, for coming back on today.
Oh, thank you for having me. I'm really glad to be here.
Of course. And for people who are not familiar with you, could you do a quick introduction of yourself?
Yeah, absolutely. I grew up as the daughter of a preacher. He was a graduate of Bob Jones, and him and my mom met at one of these Bob Jones feeder churches in California. And they ended up going all the way from California to South Carolina. And so then he decided that Utah was going to be his mission field, and he's going to be like a missionary preacher. And so I grew up in Utah, and my dad tries to convert Mormons into Baptists. We used the Bob Jones curriculum for homeschooling. It was clear from the very beginning that they wanted all 5 of us kids to go to Bob Jones. And that was an emblem of pride for them, that they could almost like brag about, oh, all my children went to Bob Jones. And so my older sister went, and then I went, and I ended up leaving after 3 years. I have 3 younger brothers. My first younger brother went 1 year, and then none of my 2 younger brothers went. The other 2 didn't go. It was just as we were waking up to it, and even within our family, it was like apparent that this is not necessarily that great. Compared to the way it was built up, compared to the way my parents talked about it and everything, when I showed up to school, I was really expecting something completely different. And I was shocked at how controlling it was and how mean everybody was about every little rule infraction. And I thought we were supposed to be training to become like warriors for God and stuff. And it felt like we were just being babysat.
Yeah, thank you so much for kind of sharing that introduction and kind of an overview. And something I think I want to start digging into is your memoir. So could you tell me about it? Title of it, the description, and really what inspired you to write it?
Sure. Starting about 7 years ago is when I started writing it. It's called Deconstructing, Memoir of a Preacher's Daughter. And I guess I had all these, what inspired me at first to write it was that I had all these memories of my childhood that were stuck inside of my brain on repeat. And I knew that I had gone through a really hard time, but I guess I didn't realize like how much trauma was informing all that, how much that the trauma was making those memories kind of stick. And I used to tell my children stories from my childhood about, oh, there was this time that we jumped off the barn, or there's this time. And they were all true stories just from my crazy childhood. And they loved them. They would come to me and beg and be like, tell me another story. Tell me another story. And I started just writing down, there's this story and there's that story. And I don't know if I was like conscious about it, but now I realize that I was trying to preserve these memories because part of healing from my past was going to have to be letting go of them. And I didn't want to lose them forever. And so I thought if I just was able to write them down, even if I didn't publish it, even if it wasn't a book, if I could just write out my stories, that would help. And so I just started one memory at a time. And then as soon as I started, I realized it was going to be a book. I don't know how, it's just intuitive. And then as I started writing the book, I realized it was going to be about my deconstruction process.
Oh my gosh. That is just, I really resonated so much with what you were saying because relating to the creative process part of it, I relate to that of I was at Bob Jones struggling and had no one to talk to and was afraid of sharing anything personal to anyone or any leader because that would be used against me. And I just started writing out my life just to get it out. And then
Mm.
deciding that, okay, this is going to be a memoir. Don't know when I'm going to publish it, when it's going to be done, but that's fine. And it is so healing to free that. And I remember seeing a quote about how, like, when we heal, the places that we used to explore with fear, you have to start exploring that with love and compassion to really, and it's hard. It's so hard to do. So I want to commend you so much for that, like to rewrite that stuff, to release it, to explore those dark emotions, and then to put it out into the world for people to hear, to learn from, to be inspired from, to give them hope, to give them healing. Oh my gosh, it's an incredible thing to do. And it's really rare for a people to get to that point, that final stage to publish that book. So I just want to say that to you and to let go of that perfectionism, to be so vulnerable with it. So thank you. Thank you so much for like publishing this book. And I'm really curious, like, how long, I think you said 7 years ago you started writing it?
Yeah.
Okay. And what has that process been like through those 7 years? We talked a little bit before we started recording, but I want people to hear what that was like for you.
Sure. So at first I was just writing it mostly on my iPhone in Google Docs. I just pull up a document and type because I was so busy. I was like running a business, going through a construction project. I didn't think I had time to write a book. And yet here I was writing. And so I would write every moment I got. If I was standing in line at the DMV or if I was unable to sleep in the middle of the night, I would just roll over and start writing. And so I would say 80% of this book was written on my phone, actually, which is crazy because it's so long. Like I had to break it into two books, actually. So there's a part one and a part two that's going to come out later this year. But anyway, so then there was phases where it was like writing, and then I had to set it aside and come back to it. And then I finally finished writing the rough draft in 2019, I want to say. So it took me about 2 years to get through the initial writing of the book. And I wasn't doing it full time or anything. I was literally running a business full time. and being a mom full time. And then on top of that, I was writing. But then I had to set it down, and it was just too hard because you had to go through the editing process, and that involved rereading the stories. And there were some of the stories that were so hard to get through that I had to set it down for even a year or more before I could come back to it. And during that time, I was healing and processing everything I'd written. And so I think there's this phrase in writing where it's called letting it settle or letting it sit. And it's a hugely important part of the writing process, especially memoir writing. And then I got a professional editor, which I highly recommend. And we did the full round of developmental and line editing. And then again, I had to let it sit. I went through her edits and everything, and then I had to let it sit because I wasn't, even though the book was ready, I wasn't ready for it to come out into the world. So it took another 2 years for me to get to this point now where I was like, okay, if I don't just pull the trigger and do it, it's never going to happen. And so I designed the cover, I formatted the interior, I did the final edit. Now I've just finished the final proofread. And it's just been a matter of waiting till I was ready and then going to the next step.
Oh, yes. And I think before we started recording, I was talking to you about the power of just also the physical part of the movement and the writing. And I think one of the things I've been realizing about writing is, you know, being a survivor, we tend to blame ourselves. There's so much self-blame from our trauma. There's voices that we've been indoctrinated with. Oh, like you're too sensitive, you're too much, or oh, it really wasn't that bad, or this and this, or oh, you're crazy, or oh, you're this. There's that self-blame we're indoctrinated with. But once you like start to really write it down, get it out, you start to realize, oh my gosh, I've been through a lot. My pain is valid. My trauma is valid. And I'm not crazy. And I am not to blame. And that is just, I think, one of the healing aspects of it that just makes it so healing. But have there been specific realizations that have been healing for you in this writing process?
Yeah, I think there's been a lot actually. The process of writing the memoir is huge because there's things you don't realize until you've actually put it out on the page and read it and edit it probably 100 times. And then you really start to see the full picture. But it's even when you're writing it, you can't see the full picture. And so for me, that was definitely part of the process, was getting it all out and then finally zooming back, like the drone footage where you finally get all the way up to the top and you're like, oh, that's how it happened. And being able to see how I was conditioned to be a people pleaser, how I was conditioned to not make a fuss, don't make anyone uncomfortable, all the things, that's what kept me in it. I had questions, I had doubts, but I knew it wasn't okay to ask those questions or it would make people uncomfortable. It would make people put me into the, well, she's questionable category. You don't want to be in that category. You want to be in the she's solid category.
Yeah, and I think we're already getting into the next question, which I think is great, is really just the impact on you of being a preacher's daughter. So the expectations, the pressures, the treatment by others and family, and the beliefs about yourself, the world, and even God.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that for all believers, but especially for those kids whose parents were in the ministry, whether they were preachers or missionaries or teachers in Christian colleges or schools, I think that you're held to this higher standard that's not really fair. You're already held to this impossible standard as a Christian of you shouldn't have bad thoughts even. You shouldn't have interior doubts even, like the way that they try to control your inner world. But with parents in the ministry, it feels like it's even more intense because what was beaten into me was that you are the model. And if you do one thing wrong and you slip up and make someone lose their soul to go to hell, that's on you, right? If you wear a skirt that's too short and you make someone trip up and sin, or if you show that you're the preacher's daughter, but you don't really believe, then how is everyone else going to believe? You might cause someone to miss the path to heaven. And so it was like we were little mini extensions of his ministry where we were supposed to show everybody that what he was saying and doing was exactly right and that we were like the examples, which is a lot of pressure because kids are kids and they're going to do stuff. And I remember just feeling very restricted in terms of always trying to be perfect and always feeling like I was failing.
And so, how would you deal with a lot of these feelings and pressures that were put on you?
I don't know if I did deal with it very well. I would often use books to escape. So I was a voracious reader. And I look back on it now and I'm like, oh, that was trauma related because I was trying to escape. But I would read 4 or 5 books at a time and have one in every room of the house so that I could just go into another world and just be there. I lived a lot in my fantasy realm in my head too, where I would just make up stories. And I was a loner kid. I didn't have I had my brother that I played with and I had my one friend, but a lot of times I would just be alone. And even with all those people around me, I felt very isolated just with my own thoughts. But I'm grateful I had my brother. He was there in it with me and we could talk to each other. There was like a pact we had of everything was okay to say, even if it was against God or our parents, we could question that with each other.
Oh, wow. Wow. And yeah, it is so isolating when you can't be yourself, you can't express your feelings or emotions, and you're isolated from the outside world. And as I've interviewed so many different survivors, like the levels of separation that you've experienced, that fundamentalism ingrains into the core of our being, our relationships and life in general, it just ruins it. It ruins relationships. It separates us. And we're meant to be connected to others and to ourselves and the world all around us. And they cut us off from that and keep us dependent on these dogmas.
Mm.
And it's just, oh my gosh, it's so harmful. And I'm curious because the word deconstructing or deconstruction, there's a taboo around it. It really scares religious communities and they try to paint it in a very black and white way and create a lot of fear like, oh, stay away from this. You're going down a dark path if you say you're doing this. And I've seen other people use different terms for questioning, like disentangling. That's a common alternative that I hear. But what I think it's important to define words. So, what is deconstructing to you? How do you define that? And what does that look like for your journey?
So for me, it means taking it like literally the construct of the religion that was built into my brain, board by board, nail by nail, taking it apart piece by piece and looking at it and saying, why is this here? Do I believe this? And at the end, I've discarded almost everything, not all, but almost everything, because I took it all apart and I looked at every piece and I decided that didn't fit anymore into my belief system.
And do you want to dig into some of those beliefs?
Sure. So I think I would liken the process of deconstruction as like peeling off layer by layer an onion to get down to the core of who you really are, who you really believe. And that onion, but every layer has been put on over the years. And it takes a long time to get down to that. The first layer is I still believe in God and Jesus, but I don't necessarily believe in all the teachings of this church or this belief system. You know, it's allowing yourself to say, maybe one or two of these things aren't right. But I'm holding on to this construct of God. And I think that's where I started. And I did stay there for quite a while, but I'm a thinker. I'm always looking for more information and being prepared to change what I think if the information doesn't line up. And so I kept looking for evidence and proof of this Christian type God. And honestly, I'm just an agnostic now. I think that there's no way to know for sure if there's a God or if there isn't a God. I just think that maybe it's not for us. Maybe it's too crazy and too bizarre for us to even wrap our heads around if there is a higher being. Maybe it's the creator of a simulation that we're all in, or maybe it's like, it could just be so random and bizarre that we just can't think of it. So why not just live and enjoy your life and be the best person you can be, because that makes you happy, it makes others happy, and not worry so much about what's outside of this earth. And I know that's not where everybody ends up, and that's fine, because I think it's a personal journey. It's about, how do you want to approach this world? How do you want to see reality?
Yeah, I love that you have that perspective, that it's a different journey for everyone. There are different conclusions that people come to and beliefs that works best for them. And it's just something that I've been really thinking a lot about today, is that really no one should be threatened, shamed, scared, just really coerced into believing anything at all or doing anything. That's not genuine, that's not real. And that's what something I've been thinking about lately is a lot in fundamentalism, they did that. They did that to us. They scared us. They threatened us. They coerced us. They shamed us. And I don't think that's what Jesus wanted at all. I think that's what Jesus really spoke out against. And just the harm that comes with trying to follow all these rules and be perfect and having the weight of that. But I love for you in that journey that you're coming to the conclusion that's healthiest and best for you. And that gives you that peace. For me, like I've been understanding it, as I've been questioning, it's like you're lifting weights off of yourself that have been, are these burdens. I don't always love the word burden because I was said a lot in fundamentalism growing up. But lifting off these weights are things that have been put on you, and just understanding what resonates with me. And I, as I've been questioning, I've been really and really on my own journey, is we need to be able to see different perspectives and understand there's different ways to look at things. When we say there's one way, that's a major red flag to me, and this is the only way, and this is there's no other option. But they don't want people to think that way because it's harder to control. So I think when we can look at different perspectives, different ways, and come to a conclusion or a way of life that's the best, that's authentic, that aligns with our authentic selves, that's I think the right path for people, however that looks like for them. And that's the thing with high control groups and really cults, is they really suppress your authentic self and give you the person that they want you to be, and who you are never goes away. It is there, and it is fighting for air to breathe, to be seen, heard, and understood. And they try their best to shove it down, to shame it, to not be in touch with that, to cut off from yourself. So it sounds like you've been able to really reconnect with that authentic part of yourself and deal with your trauma and go on your own healing journey to lifting these weights and starting to really heal that trauma. And I think another thing, I don't know if you want to answer the question, but like, why? I think I already answered it myself, but I want you to answer it. Like, why do you think deconstructing, or the word deconstructing, is so taboo in these communities?
I think, honestly, it frightens them because it's becoming an actual movement of people that are waking up to the harm of, you were saying earlier, the fear, the threats, putting that into a child, telling a child that there's something that could take you away from your family forever if you did or thought or said the wrong thing or didn't pray the right prayer or whatever. Like, to give the child, the little innocent child, the threat of forever damnation in hell away from your family, the threat of someone always reading your thoughts, like a boogeyman is how I would think of it, who could get you. That's too much for a child. Like, I actually studied early childhood development. I owned a preschool for 9 years. And that was another thing that woke me up to the harm of religious childhoods, is everything about the religious childhood homes are inappropriate for young children. Everything about it, the fear, the control, the threats, the absolute terror that I would have of the rapture coming and my soul not being saved, because I had all these, I was a human being. I had all these doubts and I had all these questions, and I had bad thoughts sometimes about wanting to learn about sex or wanting to listen to rock music. And I thought that must mean that I'm not saved. That must mean I'm going to hell. And then every day, if I couldn't find my family, like I wrote about this in my book, I couldn't find my family one time. And I thought that was it. They all went to heaven without me. And to think that a child has to live in constant fear of that, it's absolutely abuse. And it should not be allowed. I just don't, if I could, I would go and preach to the world about, and I've actually been thinking about writing not a memoir, but just a book about the issues with children growing up in fundamentalism, and coming from the perspective of someone who studied early childhood, and just go point by point of like why it's inappropriate.
Oh my gosh, I support you on that journey, and I think that is really needed. Oh my gosh, and yeah, I related to all the things that you were saying, that just religious trauma, that rapture anxiety, that fear and terror. There's a book I highly recommend. It's called Terror, Love, and Brainwashing, and it is by Dr. Alexandra Stein, and she applies attachment theory to
Oh, okay.
cults. And I read the book and it just resonated with the core of me. And it talks about a disorganized attachment
Mm-hmm.
in cults because there's this major swing between fear and terror. The person that you love and cares for you is also the person that you fear and that you're scared of. And it's so confusing. And I realized, I'm like, that's how I saw God growing up. He was someone I feared and was so afraid he was going to hit me or destroy me if I did one thing wrong. But he was also the person that would also love me. And it was just so confusing, that love and abuse that was mixed together. Excuse my language, but it's a mind fuck. Like it's just, ugh. It's like it's spiritual rape, I feel like, in a sense. Like that's how it feels. And
And what I
oh,
think it creates is a whole bunch of children who grow up and they associate fear and love together. And that's how you end up in abusive relationships, because I did. And I look back on it now and I would blame myself. You're such an idiot for choosing those kinds of relationships. And as I was writing my book, I came to the aha moment that, wait, I was set up to choose that because that's what felt normal. To be afraid of the person who loved you, that felt normal. So for me to be afraid of my husband, that was what love was supposed to be.
oh my God, I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. And you're exactly right about that. And these leaders, now that I'm starting realizing it, they're weaponizing religion to have power and control and to remain that order. That's their ultimate goal with a lot of these harmful leaders. And I know some leaders might have good intentions. I'm not saying every single leader, but I was talking to someone last night. I'm like, okay, I don't think every single independent fundamental Baptist preacher has evil intent, but I do think that they've taken their methods from a cult leader named Jack Hyles and these other IFB cult leaders with bad intentions. And they don't question it because these people say they're men of God and God told them this and told them that. And so they don't question it. And they're still perpetrating harm, even though some of them might not have that intent, but they're still using methods from a cult leader that is based on manipulation, control, and coercion. And it's still not okay. And we need to be able to question that. And as I've been on my own journey, I think there is still trying to find that wisdom in scripture. And one of the things that I have helped with me is perfect love casts out fear. That is something that is still so powerful for me
Yeah.
today. And when I'm in relationships or I analyze people, oh, like it's perfect, like fear gone. I shouldn't fear. And it is so contradictory because fundamentalism is rooted in fear. There's so much fear, fear of yourself, fear of anyone different, fear of the outside world. this extreme anxiety and fear and terror of God, of Satan. And oh my gosh, it's just that's how they control you. And it's just for me, I've tried to make sense of that. I'm like, how like it, oh my God. Anyways, still deconstructing, still questioning myself, but I don't know if you have any thoughts on what I just said.
Yeah, so I would say the anxiety part too is once I got to a certain point to where 4 years ago I started therapy, I was diagnosed with PTSD and it started in my childhood. The actual traumas, the little micro traumas that build up your whole life, and you get to the point where, and I chose, like I said, an abusive relationship, and everything was coming to a head. And I literally just couldn't cope with life anymore. I had gone so far into anxiety and depression and trauma symptoms that almost felt unmanageable. And there's been multiple times in my life when I considered just checking out because I didn't think I could handle it anymore. But I'm so glad I didn't. And I'm so glad I went to trauma therapy, EMDR, which is amazing. And it just brings it up and out of you, and you have to face it, which it's hard, definitely very hard. But I'm so glad I went through that for the past 4 years. It really helped me see and get down to the root. And what was fascinating was every time we would get down to the root of a core belief, always it would go back to childhood and religion of you're a sinner, you're bad, there's something wrong with you. All those beliefs that I had internalized started very young.
Yeah, those shame-based messages. And it
Even,
is it's so detrimental to
even
like your
just,
growth. Oh my gosh.
yeah, even just telling like very young children that they were born evil sinners that deserve death. I think that's just, again, coming from the early childhood training that I had, like that is horrifying to take a child who just, they're just existing. They don't, here they are. Oh, by the way, boom, your soul is evil. You deserve hell without this outside help. And so part of it is, I think, is that we take away the agency of every child and say, you can't do it on your own. You need God. You need church. You need this. And so you literally learn not to trust yourself because you're evil. And you can't trust your own thoughts because they're evil. You can only trust these outside things. And a lot of that gets internalized as shame and hatred for ourselves. And then that comes out in all these different disorders. You might have an eating disorder, or you might have a anxiety or depression or whatever the thing is. But I think that all comes from that core of I'm not okay. I was born bad.
Oh my gosh. Yes. And I think you're right about the manifestation of those beliefs. There's a quote by Hillary McBride, I think, and I think I'm trying to remember the quote. I might not be getting it exactly, but it's something like this. It's spiritual trauma is someone telling you that your inner critic is the voice of God.
Mm-hmm. I've heard that.
And that just hit me to my core because I remember growing up when I would struggle with these shame-based messages, my parents would say, "Oh, that Satan's telling you that." But then the church would tell me that's how I'm supposed to feel about myself. I should feel that way. I should think and feel those things. And it's what? Okay, you're telling me Satan's doing this, but then you're telling me this? This is contradictory. This isn't matching up. And I remember growing up that I thought we were supposed to have that sense of freedom when we got saved. But I learned that wasn't true in the IFB, how just weights and like expectations and the goalposts just kept moving of what was expected of you. And the shame was just further and further just shoved on. Oh my gosh. But yeah, there's so much toxicity with their approach to Christianity and their control they have over people. But I recently got a book, which I haven't even read it yet, but I'm going to recommend it. And I haven't read everything in it. I don't know their exact approach, but it's called Holy Ghosted, and it's about dealing with religious trauma, spiritual anxiety, and the language of abuse. And it covers, I've been looking at the chapters and I'm so excited to dig into it because it covers all the aspects of the indoctrination of the manifestation of it in all these different areas. And Anyway, so I recommend that. Traumatized by Religious Abuse is like a classic by Connie Baker. A lot of people read too. But with your journey, like what really made you question? I know it builds up, and I know there are different moments. So what really was there a moment that really finally made you question?
Yeah, like you said, it builds up because even as a young kid, age somewhere between 8 and 10, my brother and I would say, "Hey, do you think there really is a God? And if there is a God, why are all these kids in Ethiopia starving? Or why are all the wars happening? If there is a God, why isn't he like managing the world better?" You're taught like, oh, God's ways are mysterious and you don't know this and that. But then you see little kids starving, little kids dying of leukemia, little kids being abused by their caregivers. And you're like, if there's a God, why isn't that God doing something about this? As a young kid, I would just see injustices in the world and think, if I was God, I would do this a lot better. Like, I would actually take care of my children as opposed to letting them suffer so that they could learn some lesson. But then one really big incident, and this, it doesn't even sound that big now because I wrote it in my book and I was like, it doesn't even seem like that big of a deal, but it was for me when I was at Bob Jones. Like I said, that whole experience, Bob Jones was a big breaking point for me in terms of my faith. Because as I came out of high school, I was still planning to be a missionary. I was still planning to go into service for God. I was going to be a medical missionary, so I went to pre-med. Partly the reason I chose that was because everyone thought it was great. Like I was pushed to be in the service of God. And so I had to choose, was I going to be a teacher, a preacher's wife, or a missionary? Those were my three choices to please people. I still went to Bob Jones ready to serve the Lord. And when I got there, I thought it was going to be this pinnacle of Christianity. The best Christians in the world were there. And I was shocked. I was just shocked at how it was so different than what I expected. And everyone was just mean and controlling and petty. And it was all about this legalistic viewpoint of everything, legalized down to the letter of the law on everything. And I was like, where's the love in all this? My sophomore year, I got a job off campus at the Barnes and Noble, the Starbucks in the Barnes and Noble. And I was serving coffee late one night. It was like closing, half an hour till closing. We stopped serving coffee in glass mugs because we want to get all the dishes done. And this guy came up 10 minutes till close and he started yelling and berating us for putting his drink in a paper cup. And I want it in a mug and all this. And it was just so entitled and rude. And he made my coworker cry. And so we served it to him in a mug. And then later I saw that same person. It turns out he was a Bible teacher on Bob Jones campus. And I think that was just like an aha moment to me. Like after all the buildup and questioning, it was like, wait a second. I was like, okay, it's the entitlement. It's the arrogance. It's the I deserve because I'm special kind of mentality that I don't know. It woke me up
Yeah,
somehow.
the narcissism. Yeah, oh my gosh. And wow, wow. And I remember as I questioned fundamentalism and even my experiences at Bob Jones, I realized a lot of these people, they've read the Bible. They try to interpret it the way they've been taught to interpret it one way, and they know it from that perspective and they study it, but they have all this knowledge, but a lot of them really lack love. And it's what's the point? What is the point if you do not have love? Isn't that the whole purpose of what Jesus wanted? Living out a faith expressed in love and not judgment and legalism. And I want to say too, I'm not saying that every single person at Bob Jones is like that. I know people have had relationships with faculty that have changed their lives, and I'm not saying all of them are like that, but a lot of these authoritarian male leaders that are in these positions have caused a lot of harm. And I'm curious too, like when you talk about legalism, growing up, I was always taught legalism is, oh, it's legalists are the people who believe in the works-based salvation. And if you don't approach it that way, and then we're not legalistic, but what is your definition of legalism?
I guess the way I'm using it is like just a hyper fixation on following every little rule to the letter of the law and losing sight of the whole entire message. And so,
Yes.
with Bob Jones just really exemplifies that to me of legalism. Is you're walking down the sidewalk, you could get stopped by anybody and be told that your shirt was too low or your skirt was too high or your shoulders maybe were showing under your with your backpack up, or there would be some reason that anybody on the sidewalk could just stop you and give you demerits. If you didn't have your feet on the floor by the morning bell, if you didn't have your room clean, there was just so many little tiny dots and tittles and things you had to do every step of the way, every single day, that you started to lose sight of like why you were even doing this. Like, what's the point? And I started to feel like I was just at this, I called them, I wrote about this in my book too. I said, I feel like I just landed in a group of mind controlled zombies and they just spit back verbatim what they've been told in the exact language. And I couldn't find anybody that thought for themselves there. And I felt like that's another reason I felt extremely isolated. Like you were saying, I was afraid to talk to anybody because I could just get turned in. And if you are known as someone who's doubting, boy, that puts you in a tough place. You're suddenly in spiritual counseling. You're going to see the dean of women or the dean of men.
Yeah, yes. Yeah, sorry. Is there anything else you want to say to that?
No, I think that's mainly it.
Yeah, something, yeah. And growing up, I see legalism in a broader view now because I still think that the IFB and even Bob Jones, they teach a work-based salvation because at Bob Jones, and I said this in the Surviving BJU podcast, they tell us do this prayer, get saved is all unbelief, only through God. But there's always this catch, and this was in the IFB, and I noticed it at Bob Jones. It's you're going to follow all of these rules and everything we tell you happily because we know everything. We've interpreted this 100%. Our interpretation is perfect. Our way is perfect. So you're going to follow all these rules, and that is proof of your salvation. If you don't follow these rules and you don't happily do it and you don't desire to follow every single letter of the law, then you're not really saved. And so once you actually start happily and desire following every single one of these rules, then that is proof of your salvation. And I would argue that's still a very works-based salvation. And it's oh my gosh, it's so toxic and it's all about control.
There's that phrase, by their fruits you shall know them. And that always stuck with me because anytime I did or thought the wrong thing, I would think, oh, that's proof that I'm not truly saved. And so I can't tell you how many, probably thousands and hundreds of thousands of times I would pray the sinner's prayer, hoping like this time it's going to stick. Because I kept thinking that, okay, I know in my head they tell you you just have to pray it once, but I keep messing up. I'm not perfect. And there's that pressure to never mess up because otherwise it's going to be proof that you aren't fully saved or truly saved or whatever you're stuck inside your head all the time with these thoughts.
Yeah, they teach you to self-monitor and to self-indoctrinate yourself. And once that kind of happens, of course, they have these leaders, they have their different minions, but if they can get you to do that to yourself and then increase that shame to get you to turn yourself in, they set up this system of control that works really well in their favor. And it's not based in any kind of love at all, just coercion and control and shame and blame. But I'm curious about other experiences you had at Bob Jones with the mean-spiritedness that you saw, the legalism, and all the different toxicity.
My freshman year, and this was actually like only a month or two after going there, I remember, so Bob Jones the second, he was called Junior. He was the chancellor of the school at the time. He'd been the president, but now Bob Jones the third was when I was a student there. So he was actually scheduled to be the Sunday morning service speaker, I want to say. And I didn't know anything about him or whatever. It was like my first time sitting under his preaching. At first, I thought this guy is crazy, like literally batshit crazy, because he got up and just started like going off about toothpaste and how he doesn't even let one drop of toothpaste get wasted. And he like cuts open the tube and swishes his toothbrush around in there until there's no toothpaste left. And I'm sitting there at first, I'm like, this is a weird sermon. I just don't understand where he's like going with this. Is there just a spiritual application? And then no, he just segued directly from the toothpaste thing into like how women are basically they're evil these days because they're out there trying to get jobs and they're out there trying to protest and have careers and not stay at home and take care of their families. And I'm like, first of all, you're saying this to a whole bunch of students, half of which are women who are in college, theoretically to have a career. And most of them, though, a lot of them I knew were just there to quote, get a husband. But I was so mad that he was at the front talking about how women need to be subservient to the men. Women need to stay home and stop trying to go out there and have their own careers and their own lives. And I was so mad. I was sitting there in the church and I looked around at everyone else to be like, are you guys hearing what he's saying? Is anyone gonna? I wanted to stand up and be like, boo. But I was so afraid of getting in trouble. And here I was a freshman. I just showed up at this place and I thought I should just go along to get along. And yet I wanted to stand out in front of the auditorium and picket and be like, women are people too, or whatever. Because I just felt as a woman, that was one of my things I absolutely hated was being told that you don't have agency over your life. You never will. There will always be a man to tell you what to do, whether you marry and it's your husband, or you go to a church and it's your preacher, or there's always God, right? There's always going to be a male control figure for your whole life that you will submit to. And it just really rubbed me the wrong way. And I wanted to have that agency over my life. And so that really just chafed against me a lot. And when I sat under that sermon, I was just like, my head was about to explode.
Yeah, and like how did you deal with those teachings being taught? Did you talk to anyone or did you just keep it to yourself?
That year, I was fortunate that my best friend from high school actually came to college with me for 1 year. She quickly figured out she did not like Bob Jones and left after that, but I'm grateful I had her that first year. And I remember us talking after his sermon that day about it and being like, I just wanted to like I said, protest, but at least I had my friend to talk to about it. And even when we were sitting in our dorm room talking about, well, what did you think about that sermon? That was BS, right? We were saying it in front of her roommates, and I was afraid they were going to turn us in for saying anything negative about the chancellor of the school.
Oh my gosh, yeah. There is so much fear around just what you say, if it's not the right thing, or even just against anything against the university at all, or questioning it. Like that seen as questioning God, like that authority that they place, that they claim that they have. But yeah,
They place themselves in the same like hierarchy of God, basically.
yeah, they do. I'm really curious, what were some stories that were really difficult for you to write in this memoir?
The very most difficult one was the last part of my book was about the toxic and abusive marriage that I entered into. But it was important for me to include that because I think it's like we were saying earlier, it's the final conclusion of how you're raised. If you're raised to be a people pleaser, if you're raised to associate fear and love together, if you're all these things, that's why I chose that person who was twice my age, controlling, abusive, narcissistic. It's the perfect model of what I was set up to choose. But then at the end of the book, getting through writing through some of the abuse and then me leaving him was an important part to include in the book, but it was really hard to write.
Oh my gosh, yeah. Thank you so much for sharing that. I remember you telling me about it in our first interview in Surviving BJU. And you're right, it grooms you to be in abusive relationships. And it's so tragic. And that kind of theology and interpretation has harmed so many people and relationships. And it's so unnecessary. And and something I've been thinking a lot about too with the fear and fundamentalism that is indoctrinated into us is that it's always justified in some way, or oh, it's okay because we're doing it for this reason or this and this. There's always some kind of like phrase they say or a thought terminating cliche that like shuts down your critical thinking, and or oh, if we didn't have this fear, we would do all these terrible things. And my I understand there is, I think, a healthy kind of fear. Like, I'm afraid to touch the hot stove because I'm afraid what might happen to me. But then the unhealthy side of that fear would be, oh, I'm constantly afraid the stove is going to jump out on the wall and it's going to chase after me. I'm not thinking about the stove all day long. And I think that's what people need to understand with fear and fundamentalism is it just consumes your entire mind and how you live your life and how you view and see the world. And it's not a healthy way to live at all. And with your journey through writing this book, what do you hope that readers take away as you're reading your life story?
It's about claiming your power as a person, as a human, and recognizing when you've been in a controlling or manipulative environment. And then what are the stair steps that I took to release myself from it? And maybe it could be a little bit of a roadmap for somebody who's still in it or struggling to fully release themselves from it.
Yes. And then is there anything else you would like to say about your book?
I guess what I would like to say is that I hope it's healing. I hope it's entertaining and that it really resonates with the people who have been in a similar situation or just have been through those same traumas, that at least they know they're not alone, that somebody else went through that too, and that they can relate to all the experiences that I had and just feel like companionship and camaraderie in this life that we're put into this as children. We didn't ask to be placed into the fundamentalist community, but we were. And then the traumas, the way that your brain being bathed in fear chemicals for the first part of your life, that is a huge thing that we are just now as a society waking up to the harms of that. I just read an article on a major news outlet about how secular homes may be better suited to raise young children in rather than Christian or religious homes, because the children are not being tortured and abused in so many words. So I hope that it's helpful to people who've been there. And even if it's just people that are wanting an entertaining story about a girl who was stubborn and questioned a lot and did all the wrong things, then they'll find that too. So
Oh, yes. Thank you. Thank you so much for sharing parts of your deconstruction journey. And people can read the totality of it in your book. And I'll put the link to that in the show notes. But where can people buy that?
So it's going to be available on Amazon mainly, and then I'm going to be putting it out onto basically just worldwide, just what's called wide distribution. So it can basically be picked up by anybody in any situation.
Okay. Yeah, that's great. And again, I'll link that for people. But thank you so much, Sarah, for coming back on the show and sharing your journey. And I really have enjoyed this conversation.
Yeah, thank you for having me, and thanks for putting on this podcast and doing what you do. It's important.
Oh, thank you. That means a lot. And for people listening, thank you so much. And this was Beyond BJU. Thank you for listening to this episode of Beyond BJU. If you are listening on Apple Podcast or on Spotify, if you could leave a 5-star rating, this will help other listeners just like you discover the show. Thank you.